While the Russian military is conducting operations inside Ukraine, while it's now, according to Vladimir Putin earlier today, they're trying to set up a buffer zone in the north on 3 provinces, while they're continuing to fight in areas like Kupiansk, in the Pokrovsk area on the eastern front. The Western countries are trying to still talk about peace, and they don't want just any kind of generalized peace. They only want peace that's working for them, that's on their terms, even though they're on the bottom end of the power balance between the two sides. We're going to try to make sense about where people are right now, where all this is going, with Trump trying to maneuver all the cats together, so to speak, to have a negotiated settlement that everybody can somehow live with. And then we're going to see, is that even possible? And especially from the Russian side, where are they going right now and what is on their mind? And we have a great guest on to talk about it today. Somebody that's always one of my personal favorites, Alexander Mercouris, co-host of the Duran YouTube channel, but also somebody who just came from Russia and was in a conference that we're going to show a clip from Medvedev here in a few minutes. But first of all, welcome to the show back. As always, we're complete love to have you on. But second of all, tell us a little bit about this conference that you went to.
Well, first of all, just to say, I'm absolutely delighted to be here, and it's one of my favorite places. Now, this conference was actually a legal conference. It was a conference of lawyers. It looked at many things that are taking place in Russia, around the world. I participated in 2 panels. Pretty high-powered panels, pretty high-powered conference altogether, but it was mostly discussions about legal matters. But these are important, well-known people in Russia. Dmitry Medvedev, who we're going to be talking about, who attended this conference, is the vice chairman of Russia's Security Council, the top policy-making body. He's also the head of the Russian Military Industrial Commission. So he supervises Russia's arms industries. This is an aspect of what Medvedev does that people really don't know very much about. He is also a brilliant lawyer by all accounts and universally recognized as such. So he was the logical person to send to a lawyers' conference. But as you see, he discussed not just legal matters, but he also discussed political matters. And of course, he talked about the war. And everybody obviously was talking about the war and the conflict with the West. And these are not military people. They all had very clear views about the direction in which the war is going. And I can sum them up. I can sum up the mood with 2 words: confidence and resolve. Confidence, they're sure they're winning. Resolve, a determination to see it through.
Well, that's really telling, and more than you may realize, because just on our show yesterday, we had an interview with an American drone pilot fighting on the side of Russia, which by itself is kind of unusual. It's actually very unusual. And he conveyed the same thing at the tactical level. He said that they are absolutely confident in what they do, and their troops are fed, their morale is high. He said they get an opportunity to take vacation off the front line. They get rotated so they don't get worn out, etc. But when I specifically asked him, if you guys had to keep fighting, even if it was for, as the Russian negotiator in the last round in Istanbul with Ukraine, he said, if we had to fight another year, 2 years, 3 years, it didn't matter. We would fight for as long as it takes. I said, okay, it's one thing for that guy to make the statement, but what about the people who have to do it? And he said, there is absolute unanimity. Nobody has any hesitation about what we will do. And he agreed with you, said the same thing that you see up at that, I guess you would call the strategic level. So I think that's very telling.
Absolutely. I mean, that is the mood. By the way, I also went to St Petersburg itself. I had somebody to help me from the Russian Ministry of Justice, but I spoke to people. Exactly the same mood on the streets. And St Petersburg, an interesting, very, very interesting place, very beautiful city, former capital of Russia. A place where they remember the war, the Second World War, very vividly. It was the scene of one of the great sieges, and there were monuments to the war everywhere and commemorations about the Second World War everywhere. And I mean, the general mood is, we are not a warlike people. We don't want to be involved in war. But if we are pushed, and they do feel that they've been pushed, then we will fight, because it's absolutely essential to us that we do. Our country is united. We support the army. We support our president. We want to see this end in victory. We're happy if it's negotiated, a negotiated outcome, but it must be one that satisfies our security needs. And if not, well, we will see it through. We'll fight it to the end. And I have to say straight away that if you saw St. Petersburg now, it's an affluent, prosperous city. There's very few signs of economic stress. People talk a lot about sanctions, about the cracking economy, about all of these kind of things. I saw no sign of that at all in St. Petersburg whilst I was there. In fact, it's a considerably richer place than it used to be when I last saw it, which was admittedly 9 years ago. So, I mean, a lot of time since. But having said that, I mean, there's a very, very visible improvement in the standard of living. And I didn't see any signs of economic stress at all.
It's interesting you said that's another similarity with what I heard at the tactical level.
Yeah.
You just mentioned that they do want peace, but only a peace that meets their conditions. That is almost verbatim what this American who's fighting for the Russians said among he and his Russian compatriots. He said that they all want, he said, of course, we don't want to fight a war. We don't want to risk getting killed every day, but we would rather fight for years more as opposed to taking some kind of a deal that's less than what the minimum requirements are as they view it for their security. And I think that is a vital thing that especially our Western audience, particularly here in America, that we understand. And unfortunately, I think we're really far from that understanding.
Exactly. I'll just say one last quick thing about St. Petersburg, which is, of course, it's a major industrial center. It's a major center of Russia's military industries, helicopter engines, warships. They're all made there. Artillery systems, I believe. I'm not an expert on this, but the Russian industrial economy is working 24/7 to support the war.
Yep, and we've certainly seen a lot of that. Unfortunately, we've seen it play out on the battlefield to the disadvantage of the Ukraine side. More on that in a minute. But let's jump ahead. Let's go ahead and just jump right in here. These are a couple of statements that we heard from Dmitry Medvedev during this conference, which were pretty eye-opening, and or at least should be if he means what he says. First of all, he's basically saying something that I think that you and I have discussed here before, that we're probably in the last opportunity for peace that there's going to be, because if we don't get it here, I think the next thing is the army's just going to keep rolling until they get what they want on the battlefield. Here's how he put it.
As for the current Ukraine, we all know that we are not happy with the current political regime in Ukraine. But nonetheless, this is the last chance to Ukraine to preserve, once the military actions are over, to preserve some kind of statehood or some kind of international recognition as a subject of international law and its right for future development.
So, number one, I'm just wondering what you thought when he said it at the time. And then second, did you have any conversations with anybody else after the fact, and what did they think?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he said that, obviously. Now, that is a final warning to Ukraine, and it's also a final warning to the West as well, that if you really want to help Ukraine, if you want to preserve Ukraine, then you have to be serious about pressing forward with these negotiations which President Trump has worked very hard to bring about. But now is the moment for Ukraine to be realistic about where it is and to understand that this is its last chance. If the Ukrainians fluff this, if they make impossible demands, if they say that they're only interested in a ceasefire and nothing else, if they go on saying that they have an irreversible right to join NATO and that they want all their 4 territories returned and anything of that kind, then the war will continue. The Russians, as I said, are full of confidence and they will see it through. And at the end of it, there is a very strong possibility indeed, a real possibility that there will be no Ukraine. So, I mean, Medvedev said it absolutely straightforwardly and very, very clearly. And the audience is receptive to this. as I said, to repeat again, these are lawyers. These are not people who were, if you like, drawn from the military industrial complex. They're not soldiers. They're not people of that kind. They are the kind of people who, if you like, have been exposed most to the rupture with the West. A lot of them worked for law firms that do international work. They've been affected by the sanctions. They've had their business, to some extent, affected by all of this. But nonetheless, and in spite of that, they support completely what Medvedev said. I didn't come across anybody who took a different view. Anybody at all.
And that's whether Russian or any other countries?
Well, I mean, people from other countries, no doubt. I mean, I didn't want to talk about that too much because obviously they've got their own perspectives. But what I will say this, again, there was people from India, people from Angola, people from other countries as well. Their overall sense seemed to be that the war is the product of Western overreach, that we pushed the Russians into a corner, and they would prefer, I think, to see a negotiated end to the war because of the disruptions it's causing to the international system. They would probably not want to see Ukraine disappear. In fact, they definitely wouldn't.
Yeah.
But ultimately, if that happens, my sense is most of them will accept it and they will blame the West.
Wow, that's quite a telling statement there, that others will not blame Russia, because on the U.S. side especially, and on the European side, as we're going to see here shortly, most of the blame, if not all the blame, actually all the blame, is put on Russia. But I want to play one more clip, because if anybody wasn't sure what Medvedev meant when he said this is the last chance for peace, he spelled it out shortly thereafter.
И такие переговоры могут позволить обрести мир. Но нужно помнить, что для киевского режима есть и другой путь, о котором тоже неоднократно говорилось. Это путь безоговорочной капитуляции. Такая формула мира в международном праве тоже существует. Если сказать прямо, многим в нашей стране она нравится куда больше.
What do you make of that last phrase there? And if I'm being honest, most of the people don't want the negotiated version. They want an unconditional surrender version.
Well, I think the thing that Medvedev was referencing here, was also the Second World War. Because beyond a certain point in the Second World War, I mean, this was the actual demand within Russia that whatever the cost, the only way to achieve peace was through the unconditional surrender of the enemy. And I mean, the Russians very early on came to that view, and it was one that they agreed with the United States, with President Roosevelt, and that became their policy. It was almost a slogan, by the way, just to say. So this is, I think, the attitude that they have now. So the Russians have just celebrated the victory. And by the way, just to make one thing very clear, they went out of their way, everybody I spoke to went out of their way to say this was a common victory. One of the most interesting things was the remarkable absence of anger towards the West and a continuing desire to think of the United States especially as our former ally in that war. I mean, it was very surprising, and it surprised me. But nonetheless, what Medvedev is referencing is that, and he's saying this is the outcome of the previous war that we fought for the survival of Russia. And we wanted unconditional surrender then. And many, many people in Russia today feel that in some respects, this war is an echo of that greater war. Many of the issues are the same, and they feel that the right way to end it is through an unconditional surrender again. So an uncompromising mood, and it's one that people need to take into account. If this is, in my opinion, I mean, it was Ukraine is now in the last chance saloon. If it doesn't come to terms, I fully expect the war to go on as the Russians say, to a victorious conclusion.
And what do you say to those critics, especially in the United States, that say, yeah, but Medvedev is a clown. He makes these brash statements all the time. Half the stuff he says doesn't ever come to pass. And besides all that, it's taken Russia. There was a piece in, I want to say it was the Wall Street Journal last month that said, look, if at the current pace of advance of the Russians, it would take them like another 10 years to be able to conquer all the rest of Ukraine anyway.
Yeah.
They're not going to be able to do it. So that's just a bunch of just blather.
Yeah. Well, a few things first. I mean, he's not a clown. He's a former president. He's a former prime minister. He's the deputy head of the Security Council, and he is the head of the Military Industrial Commission. And we've spoken many times about how Russia's military industries have surged. I mean, he's the man in charge. He's the person who, to a great extent, has brought that about. So you can't call him a clown. Now, he does express the more hardline position within the Russian government. Putin and Medvedev, who are very, very closely allied with each other and who are friends. I mean, there's clearly been a division of labor. Putin is, if you like, the soft cop. He's the person who negotiates. He's the person who uses the measured language. He talks to the outside world, to the foreign leaders, he's the one who conducts the negotiations. Medvedev talks to Russians, which is what he did in this speech. He says, look, this is what we're about. This is what we want to see. We will negotiate and achieve our objectives through negotiations through a peaceful way if we can. But ultimately, if it comes to it, we will win the war and we will defeat the enemy and we will have an unconditional surrender. And that reflects the public mood. So you can't just say it's Medvedev the clown, because he speaks. What he's speaking for is the attitudes of tens of millions of people in Russia. They're not warlike, they're not angry, but they are resolute. And I think anybody who thinks otherwise is deluding themselves. Now, about the the slow pace of the Russian advance. Firstly, I don't think over the last 12 months it's actually been that particularly slow. The Ukrainian army is Ukraine is an enormous country. The battle is taking place in one particular part of eastern Ukraine. If the Russians win that battle, then they have won the war. I mean, to me, that is obvious. I think you've explained it far better than me in many articles and in many programs. And I find it very difficult to understand why people just don't get it.
Well, as it turns out, it's not just Medvedev that's having these kinds of comments. It's increasingly even the otherwise diplomatic face of the Russian government, Sergei Lavrov. Now, you mentioned earlier that the Western Europeans and the United States, and many in the United States anyway, apparently even Donald Trump, have been saying that we are pressing, in fact, we demand a 30-day unconditional ceasefire on Russia first, and then we'll talk about details secondly. And the Russians, I remember initially when President Putin and Trump first talked, Trump said, I want a ceasefire. I want to get a ceasefire. I got Zelensky to agree to an unconditional. I need you to do the same. And instead of just saying no right out the bat, Putin said, well, we'll consider that. But there's some nuances, some details we have to work out. And so a lot of people read a flexibility in there that, well, maybe they'll give into it. Well, if anybody did think that, Sergei Lavrov today squashed all of that when he was explicit in saying this.
Is the work on the memorandum underway? Yes, it is. It is underway. I don't know about the other side, but we are now in an advanced stage of working on the memorandum, and we will provide our memorandum to the Ukrainians in any case, and we will expect them to reciprocate. Are there any timelines? No, we have not yet agreed on any timeline. There are many fantasies thrown about when the next round will happen, but we don't have any specific ideas at the moment.
Sorry, I got my sound bites a little bit out of order. That's one where he's talking about talking about this stuff is something we're talking about much later. Gary, if you can play that the next one there.
You're putting the cart before the horse. First, we need to have a treaty, and once it is agreed upon, then we'll decide. But President Zelensky, as President Putin has repeatedly stated, lacks legitimacy. This is acknowledged even within Ukraine. Therefore, when the treaty is ready, and it is far from certain that this will happen tomorrow, it must be structured in a way that prevents a repeat of what the 2014 coup plotters, who came to power through a bloody coup, did. Only then will we see who among the Ukrainian authorities possesses legitimacy.
So in that first clip we saw, he's talking about how even these so-called memorandums, which for context, anybody who may not have seen that, is that in the last Istanbul meeting, the two sides came out saying that they'll create these memorandums that put out their positions, that then they can start to see if there's room to actually bring them together. The Russians are saying, yeah, we'll get to that at some point, and there's no deadline on that. But this one, he says, you're putting the cart before the horse if you think we're going to have a ceasefire first. We're going to have a peace treaty first. And by the way, this one is going to have, as he said elsewhere, the issues about the root causes of the war, which are all these draconian situations that I don't think anybody in Ukraine will ever agree to. But he is declaring that we're having maximalist desires here and we're calling the shots. How do you see it?
Well, that's exactly what he said. I mean, he on the subject of a ceasefire, ever since Putin spoke about, how the Russians see the war ending, a speech he gave to the Russian Foreign Ministry in June last year, the Russians have consistently said that they do not like the idea of a temporary ceasefire. Whenever there's been a temporary ceasefire before, Ukraine has taken advantage of it to rearm, re-equip, reinforce, rest its soldiers, and especially at a time when the Russian army is advancing and holds the advantage. From a Russian point of view, it makes no sense at all to have a ceasefire. I think, if I may say, I think it was very unfortunate that a lot of time was wasted after President Trump was inaugurated trying to get to this ceasefire. I think that whoever advised him to go down that path had not been listening to what the Russians were saying. And I think a lot of time would have been saved if President Trump had gone directly towards discussing with the Russians what the outcome of the war might be and had agreed to push the Ukrainians towards talking with the Russians. Well, we are there now. I mean, it's perhaps unfortunate that 3 months have gone, but at least we are now there when there is.
So let me ask you a question on that, because there's been, 2 or 3 phone calls between Putin and Trump, at least that we were publicly aware of. And there's been at least 3 visits by Steve Witkoff with Putin, one of which lasted 5 hours by itself. So one would imagine that all throughout this time, Putin has been pretty clear and direct on what behind the scenes, what he's going to require, which seems to be pretty much out of touch with what we're trying to say publicly. How do you see that dynamic?
Yeah, I this is a good question. I think that what has happened is that the President of the United States has finally understood that the Russians mean what they say. They mean what they say about their terms. They mean what they say about the fact that they don't want an unconditional ceasefire, or indeed any sort of ceasefire, really, and that they want negotiations with the Ukrainians. And that is the only way to get to an outcome which might lead to peace. And I think that to his credit, by the way, the President of the United States has finally grasped that and has listened to the advice that I think he's been receiving from all sorts of people, some of it well-intentioned, some of it perhaps not so well-intentioned, who are telling him, go for a ceasefire first. And I think he's now understood that the only way forward, if there's going to be a negotiated peace, is through what the Russians have been saying all along they're prepared to do, which is direct negotiations. By the way, the head of the Russian negotiating team, Mr. Medinsky, who is a historian, has pointed out that in many, many wars, perhaps most wars, negotiations take place and there is no ceasefire. there is no ceasefire until some kind of general agreement is basically sorted out, so that it makes sense at that point to have a ceasefire. And he cited the Paris talks between the United States and Vietnam, the Korean talks that took place in the 1950s, and various others.
You know, it's funny that you mentioned Medinsky. I saw this morning that apparently the United States, one would imagine under the pressure from the Ukraine side, is trying to get Medinsky removed from the Russian negotiating team. I just found it puzzling that we think that we can tell the Russians who they're going to send to their direct negotiations, but there it is. So I doubt that's going to work, but that's apparently, according to the news today, what we're trying to get done here. I want to kind of zero in on something we were talking about a second ago about the end of the phone calls that happened this past Monday, first between Trump and Putin, or actually first between some of the Europeans and Trump, and then had this long conversation with Putin, 2 hours or so. And then he called and talked back to the Europeans after he had talked to Putin. Now, Trump comes out with his Truth Social and says the talks went great. I think there was a really good atmosphere. I would have said so if it would have been any different. I really want to get this war over with quick. And then, according to Axios and some other reports subsequently to that when Trump called back and talked to the European leaders and Zelensky, apparently they were all sitting around a table on one phone when it happened, that he was again upbeat and thinking things were good, but then they're like, wait, what? There's not going to be a ceasefire? That's not, and the Russians are going to keep fighting until they get a deal, which is exactly what Lavrov said today. So again, you see a consistency in the message, but the question is, what is going to be the impact of that on the Europeans and the Ukrainian side? Because I haven't seen any acknowledgement of that. In fact, I've seen more that they're continuing on with their previous, I call fantasies about how they want this to be.
Well, this is exactly correct, because they're not listening now, not just to what Putin is saying, but to what the President of the United States is saying. He is saying to them, look, I've tried to get this ceasefire for you, but the Russians are not going to agree. And I'm not able to force the Russians to agree to a ceasefire. The key thing is that for the moment, at least, the Russians want to talk. So, we should build on that and talk to them. And yes, the Russians have very, very tough terms. But if we go on talking tough to them in the way that we're doing now, they will have no incentive to moderate their terms. If, on the other hand, we do what we ought to be doing, which is try to find some common ground with them and try to build trust with them, then ultimately we might get somewhere. We might end the war and preserve Ukraine. Now, obviously, the president didn't use those words. I wasn't in on the call, but I think that is.
I wouldn't have been surprised, by the way. I would, and you probably should have been.
I think that was the essence of his message. The trouble is, the Europeans don't want to hear this. They're still stuck on the idea of getting a freeze of the war, because when they talk about a ceasefire, what they really mean is a freeze of the war, to stop the Russian army in its tracks where it is now, and to keep it there indefinitely, and to make no further concessions. No concessions on NATO membership, even though the President of the United States says that he thinks that is really a done thing. There's no way that Ukraine can join NATO. So they're not prepared to agree to that. The Germans are now talking, like the British are, about Ukraine's irreversible pathway towards NATO. They're not prepared to agree to any of the other things that the Russians have been talking about, even things like the rights of Russian citizens in Ukraine itself. They're talking about setting up war crimes tribunals to try Russian officials. I mean, it's almost as if they're intent on sabotaging. Well, it's not as if, they are trying to sabotage the entire diplomatic initiative that the President of the United States is taking.
Okay, let's go down that road here, because this is a problem. And for more than what that may seem the obvious reason, since that phone call where Trump is reported to have told them Russia is going to keep fighting, they're not going to do a ceasefire, they won't stop until they have achieved their goals, you had Zelensky come out and directly say, we will not be given any ultimatums. We will not minimize our military. We're going to continue doing that. And I'm still looking for security guarantees. Then you had, I think it was on Wednesday, Kaya Kallas comes out and says, we are going to force Russia into terms that we want. And so here is the 17th package of sanctions, which is going to go after energy and Shadow Fleet and some other things like that. And then we're getting ready for an 18th one here. And I just have to see, just on the surface of it, you had, by your own mouth, had just said you have tried 16 rounds of sanctions on Russia since this thing began, and none of them have had the desired effect. By what possible rationale can we say now that 17 and 18 is going to have an effect when it didn't before? All of that rolls into, then what is the European objective here? What do they think they're going to accomplish? I mean, surely, Alexander, they're not ignorant of the imbalance between the powers, that Ukraine can't survive on the battlefield much longer because there is no more path for the United States for weapons and ammunition. I mean, I'm asking, that's kind of a complicated question, but help.
No, it's not complicated. It's very straightforward. I mean, why are these people basically not facing reality? Why do they want to prolong a war that is being lost? I mean, why are they still talking about sanctions and talking about going for more and more sanctions when all the attempts at sanctions have not been successful? Now, there is some kind of stubbornness, bloody-mindedness, if you like, about this, which is very difficult to explain. But I think that there are certain things that underlie this. Firstly, and I think we've discussed it in previous programs, they do not want to see a rapprochement, a reconciliation of any kind, or even a normalization of relations between the United States and Russia. They are very worried that if that happens, then the United States will start to draw down its forces in Europe, and it will develop a strong relationship with Russia, and Europe will become marginalized. And this is something that collectively, almost instinctively, they fear. So better a confrontation with Russia that goes on indefinitely, even if that means sacrificing Ukraine, than have a situation where the United States and Russia are finally starting to get on with each other and might, as I said, the Americans might start saying, well, we've done our job in Europe. The Cold War is over. Maybe it's time that we started to, scale down our involvement here. We're not saying we're walking away from NATO or anything like that, but we're not going to be here as much as we were previously. So that's one thing. I think there are other things too. I think there is an extraordinary loathing of President Putin and an inability to accept the fact that he's going to win the war, or at least achieve his objectives. And I think there is this visceral attitude. And I have to say it also. I think amongst some of them, there is also a visceral feelings about the President of the United States. They, at one level, don't seem to like him very much. At another level, they've convinced themselves that they can manipulate him. And I think they're deeply frustrated that they failed to do that. And I think that makes them want to push back against proposals towards peace that he is making. Now, there are probably other reasons that you can find, but I suspect they're more in the world of psychology than international relations. And, I am not a psychologist at the end of the day.
So let's see if we can address another theory about why the Europeans are seemingly disconnected from reality. The more pernicious view is that they're not disconnected at all, that they understand how this war is going to go, and that because of their visceral dislike for Russia, they need to keep a unifying enemy out there. And so they're willing to sacrifice Ukraine in order to get that. And I say that because there is some evidence that Europeans are already looking beyond this war to keep and going the animosity on the other side of it. For example, Germany is now in the process of putting an armored brigade into Lithuania that's going to be pushing forward. Europe, and I'll touch on this in a second, as we've talked, I think you and I've talked about before, is on a $800 billion rearm program, etc., all of which is in the view of Russia. And I want to look first of all at the German side, because here's what their Minister of Defense Pistorius said just a day or so ago.
The greatest threat to our security in Europe today and in the foreseeable future is an aggressive, revisionist Russia. We cannot and we will not look away. Without security, there is no freedom. And without security, there's no sovereignty. This is why we have to be prepared. We must demonstrate that we are ready. Our decision to deploy this brigade here in Lithuania is a central part of this message. It strengthens NATO's posture on the eastern flank. It is a most tangible expression of the Zeitenwende, the turning point in German security and defense policy.
So there's no possibility that Russia is reacted as a rational actor would if, since 2008, when it was first declared in the Bucharest summit that NATO was going to advance up to the border with Russia and Georgia and Ukraine. It can't be what happened in the 2014 Maidan affair, where the legally elected government of Ukraine that was pro-Russia was forced out of power and a pro-Western was in its place. It can't be what happened in the Civil War, etc. And it can't be happen with the declaration by then Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg in December and again in January 2022 that the Ukraine will join NATO, or that we said in summer last year in Washington, D.C., it is inevitable that Ukraine will join NATO. It can't be because any of that. It can only be because Russia is a revanchist, want to recreate the Soviet empire and all this kind of stuff. And so therefore we have to have military forces to go forward. Seems to me they're building a really strong case to, no matter how this war is ended, that they keep going with this conflict with Russia. How do you see it?
Well, that's exactly correct. I mean, that's exactly what they're trying to do. I think one of the things to understand is that Europe over the last 30 years, since the end of the Cold War, has been involved in something of a political experiment, an unusual political experiment of European integration. Now, this policy, this experiment is coming under increasing amount of opposition from all people right across Europe. You see this in country after country. In my country, people voted to leave the European Union altogether, for example. You see this in recent elections in places like Romania. You see this in Germany, where there were elections also. So how do you keep this project of ever deepening integration going? You develop a common enemy, and you have this specter of the old adversary, Russia, which is being conflated to some extent with the Soviet Union. You talk about that it's this revanchist state that is out to dominate and subjugate Europe. Notice, by the way, that not only did they never mention any of the things that you listed, all of the reasons why the Russians might have reacted in the way that you say, but they've never really given an explanation of why Russia would want to behave in that way, why it would want to threaten and take over the whole of Europe, because this isn't just recreating the Soviet Union. The way they're talking is about, this is a threat to everyone in Europe. But nobody explains why Russia would want to march on London or take over Paris or occupy Berlin. Nobody provides any kind of reason for that. But you talk about it, you create a war psychosis in Europe, you create fear, you talk about rearmament, you do all of these kind of things in order ultimately, not even in my opinion so much to rearm, but to continue with this project of centralizing and uniting Europe, which, as I said, has run into all kinds of opposition from all sorts of places right across, right across Europe. And I think it's sustainable, by the way. I think that far from succeeding, it's going to fail. But in the meantime, it's doing massive damage and it's going to destroy Ukraine, just as you said.
And let's take a look at where that's a first look. We've mentioned the rearm program before. Here is just a recent comment by Ursula von der Leyen, President of the European Union, when she talked about it in these terms.
In the various meetings in the last few weeks, most recently 2 days ago in London, the answer from European capitals has been as resounding as it is clear. We are in an era of rearmament. And Europe is ready to massively boost its defense spending, both to respond to the short-term urgency to act and to support Ukraine, but also to address the long-term need to take on more responsibility for our own European security. And this is why today I have written a letter to the leaders ahead of Thursday's European Council. This is why we are here together today. I have outlined in this letter to the leaders the Rearm Europe plan. This set of proposals focuses on how to use all the financial levers at our disposal in order to help member states to quickly and significantly increase expenditures in defense capabilities, urgently now, but also over a longer period of time over this decade.
So it seems to me that obviously that this is on a European-wide situation here, but they want to focus on Russia as the enemy and this need to rearm $800 billion over a period of time, a huge amount of money. I know there's lots of questions about whether they can actually get it and how far this may go, but that is their stated objective and intention, is to go down this path. My question to you, though, is that the only path that Europeans can go on to establish peace and security long-term with Russia, which is going to continue to exist there no matter what?
No, of course it isn't. I mean, the obvious solution would be to assist the President of the United States to achieve peace in Ukraine and thereby peace in Europe. I mean, it's obvious. It's not complicated. But let's go back to Ursula von der Leyen. She is supposed to be the president of the Commission of what is supposed to be, or what was originally, an economic organization. She's now talking about, managing a rearmament program across the whole of Europe. I mean, she has no mandate to do that. That is not what her institution was ever set up for. And yet now she's talking in this way. And I'm going to say something. I think that if you think about this carefully, notice that she's not really going into the weeds. She's not talking about how to rearm. She's not talking about, factories and supply chains and building up the kind of things, a kind of military industrial complex, so that you have, such as the one you have in the United States. She is talking about money, 800 billion euros, managing to control the money flows across Europe. And again, this is clearly a centralizing objective. The European Centre controls the money flows. It can switch them on or switch them off as it chooses, even as it pushes Europe towards rearmament and towards permanent confrontation with Russia. It is a nightmarish plan, actually, that Ursula von der Leyen is outlining. And any European leader who really had the interests of Europe at heart would understand that and would seek the kind of alternative that is actually being offered. Now, Bismarck, and Ursula von der Leyen is German, and I believe Prussian, by the way. Bismarck once said, "Secret of politics, a good treaty with Russia." Now, that's what the Europeans should be thinking about.
And, obviously I'm in 100% concurrence with you. But one of the things that I worry about is that even if, like, in their heart of hearts, there are those within Europe that say, well, we don't really want a war with Russia, but we sure want to have them up there as a boogeyman, and so we can keep having more of this money to go this way and keep them as a perpetual enemy, that you have the risk of running into a self-fulfilling prophecy that you may end up with the very war that you claim you want to prevent, because these actions don't come in a vacuum. Actions have counteractions, and we've already seen here in recent days that Russia is taking action on their flank.
Russia is building up forces near the border with Finland, creating new Arctic tensions amid the war in Ukraine. The New York Times reports. New satellite imagery confirms that Russia is actively bolstering its military presence near the Finnish border, with the construction of new tents, fighter jet shelters, and warehouses potentially signaling the Kremlin's long-term strategy in response to Finland joining NATO. Tents, shelters for fighter jets, and warehouses for military equipment indicate a growing Russian presence near one of NATO's newest members. The publication writes, NATO confirms that Russia's activities resemble preparations for the deployment of significant forces in the event of the end of the war in Ukraine. Russian troops are strengthening bases and building military infrastructure near the Finnish border, which could reveal their strategy for what happens after the war in Ukraine.
I went on an American television network when that report was first aired here earlier this month. And the way that the anchor put it to me was, she said, you know what? This kind of buildup that the Russians had is the same thing they did around the Ukraine border before they attacked here. Do we need to be worried about that? And I kind of gave the list of the things I told you a second ago about, here's a lot of the things that are not being talked about, things that the West is doing about Germany, the Baltics, Poland, keep telling their people, we need to get ready for war by 2030. I said, of course, Russia's going to take a reaction to that on their border here. But it's still used as evidence of that. So do you have this risk? And or maybe a better question is, what do you see the risk are that each side keeps seeing the other side do something tangible, and then they keep doing this until all of a sudden you've got a possibility for a crisis?
We absolutely do have exactly that kind of possibility for a crisis. Now, we've been here before in Europe, because if you go back in European history to the events which ultimately set off the European catastrophe of the 20th century, that all started with massive rearmament by all the various states of Europe: France against Germany, Germany against Russia, Austria against Italy, Britain against Germany. And there was a tremendous drive to rearm, and there was massive propaganda by each of these countries against the other. And of course, it did in the end lead to war. It led to the First World War. And that was an absolute catastrophe for Europe, one from which arguably we have never fully recovered. And the whole thing is playing out again, because exactly as you said, the rearmament of one side, the actions taken by one side supposedly to deter the other, are provoking the other to take steps in order to ensure, as it believes, its own security. So this policy, if it is a policy, I'm not sure that anybody, by the way, have sat down and said it and worked it out exactly like this, creating a bogey, a Russian bogey to unite Europe. But I suspect there is some sense of this. I suspect that at some level, they do all understand this, that this is a way of driving, as I said, forward European unity. It is an incredibly reckless and very dangerous thing, which has been done before and has ended in an epochal humanitarian cataclysm, which is the two world wars. It's incredible that we don't seem to understand that lesson.
And now then there's nuclear weapons on both sides of the line. So the potential is far worse than what has happened already. Listen, I'm running a little bit short on time, but there's two more things I want to really get to. So if you could, please, first of all, if Keir Starmer was watching this, which probably he does all the time, and Donald Trump said, hey, you know what, Alexander Mercouris, you seem to have a lot of understanding of this stuff. What can we do to walk ourselves back from this? Give us some kind of an optimistic and realistic scenario to what the West writ large could do to back out of this. It's going to actually tamp down tensions and actually give us a possible good path to get to a peace and security?
There's two things we can do immediately. The first is to support the President of the United States in his attempts to normalize relations with Russia, not work constantly to undermine them. I mean, this is so misguided. I mean, it almost bewilders me that this isn't understood. The second is, if we are not happy with what the Americans are doing, then we should speak to Moscow ourselves, as the Russians have repeatedly said that we can do. We should send somebody to Moscow to speak on our behalf to the Russians and to see what can be agreed to stabilize the situation in Europe and to take matters forward. We should, in other words, undertake diplomacy. We should support the President of the United States in normalizing relations with Russia, and we should ourselves take steps to normalize relations with Russia. Done intelligently, the two efforts would be complementary.
Well, I certainly hope the Prime Minister does call you this afternoon and takes your advice. I would advise or recommend it. But one thing that could work against it, against following the lead of the United States, is the leader of the United States, who today announced that he was going to put a 50% tariff on Ukraine, on the European Union. Went through this long list of alleged violations and things that is costing us $250 billion a year. So how is this landing in Europe today?
Well, it's not landing at all well. But then what have we done since the president was elected to make him feel more favorable to us? Have we really sent our people to Washington to talk about trade? Have we discussed these matters with him? Have we treated him with the kind of respect that the President of the United States might expect? No, we haven't. We spent far more time talking to him about Ukraine and trying to get him to agree to impose sanctions on Russia. So here we are. We find ourselves in a situation where he's going to go ahead with tariffs, and we've not really made our case against it.
Now we had John Mearsheimer on the show right before we came on with you, and I asked him the same question, and he suggested that this might be Trump trying to put pressure on Europe in order to get them to come across and join with him on some of these issues related to the Russia-Ukraine war. Do you have any sense of that?
Well, I would hope so. I mean, I think that Trump does think in this kind of way. I think he does. I think that is not far-fetched. I think that Trump does understand that if you've got leverage, sometimes you can apply it, and you might be able to get the Europeans to to listen finally and to start taking the kind of things that he's saying seriously and not trying to undermine him and sabotage him all the time. So I don't disagree with that. The only thing I would say is that I don't think the Europeans are going to accept that message. I think that's all this is going to do is make them even more antagonistic to the president of the United States. And I suspect that eventually on this specific issue, some kind of deal will be done. But instead of that be used as a pathway to understanding between the Americans and the Europeans, we will still see tensions between the Europeans and the Americans increase, with the Europeans talking all the time about betrayal, something which annoys me a lot, by the way. I mean, it seems to me well, anyways, to say it's unhelpful, it would be an understatement, but I don't want to launch me off on this. But anyway, they're talking about this, using words like betrayal and abandonment and words like that, instead of grappling with the realities, talking with the Americans seriously, and speaking finally to the Russians. It's not difficult.
It's not. And if Prime Minister Starmer calls you, I hope that President Trump would call us or Gary, either one, because I would encourage them to actually work much more cooperatively together so that nobody has to quote, win or lose, that we can have a win-win situation, because there's definitely one on the table should we reach out and choose it.
Absolutely. As the US, the United States and Europe did in the 60s and 70s during the era of détente, which turned out very well for both of us in the end.
It did, and I pray that that's exactly where this ends up too, however muddled it may be today. But listen, as always, an absolute delight to have you on, and let everybody know that you don't have to wait just to see Alexander when he's on our show. You can go to his channel, the Duran, there, and he's got some great stuff. I was actually watching yours with Alex earlier today, so you guys should do the same, because there's always great stuff there.
Thank you very much, Daniel, and I'm delighted to be on this program and look forward to coming again.
Look forward to that too. Thank you very much, and we will see you all on the Daniel Davis Deep Dive.